Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. You are watching L24 News Russia-Ukraine special coverage with me. I'm Abdurrahim Kashur, live here from Algiers. The world is still struggling to find a final resolution to Russia-Ukraine war that has seen thousands of dead people and millions displaced and multiple cities destroyed, among many other tragic scenarios. When Russia's operation began, nothing suggested a deadline within which its goals are going to be achieved. Right now, Ukraine is retaking territories as Russia seems to abandon its operation in the north and moves to the east, where its complete focus lies. On the other side, Ukraine is asking for more weapons from its allies. To this point, one can say, why is NATO calling Russia to stop this conflict, but at the same time, still giving weapons to Ukraine and still trying to bring more countries to its side, such as Sweden and Finland right now? And is Russia really losing this military operation by moving only to the east, not toward the capital? Multiple questions are directed to our panel of guests, Mr. HARLEY, SCHLANGER, Vice Chairman of SCHILLER Institute from Germany, and VALENTIN, YAKUSHIK, an international relations professor from Ukraine. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. Show begins right after this break. Joe Biden confirmed Tuesday accusing his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin of genocide in Ukraine, a few hours after using this word for the first time to describe the situation in the country invaded by Moscow. The American president stated to journalists during a trip to Iowa that it's increasingly clear that Putin is simply trying to erase the very idea of being a Ukrainian.
Yes, I called it genocide because it's become clearer and clearer that Putin is just trying to wipe out the idea of even being able to be a Ukrainian. And the evidence is mounting. It's different than it was last week. The more evidence is coming out of literally the horrible things that the Russians have done in Ukraine. And we're going to only learn more and more about the devastation. And we'll let the lawyers decide internationally whether or not it qualifies, but it sure seems that way to me. Thank you.
Mr. Valentin, I will be starting with you since you are a Ukrainian and your country is in the midst of this conflict. Do you think it's really thanks to the US and UK and in general the West, Russia is not moving forward toward the capital?
Well, Russian leadership just failed to implement its original plan. To have a kind of blitzkrieg, to capture Kiev, to make a regime change. Then they saw that their actions near Kiev and in Chernihiv, they are not efficient, so they changed their tactics and they took forces from that regions of Ukraine to the east of Ukraine. The American influence maybe and Western influence in general maybe only in supporting with weapons Ukraine. But what is most important, this is Ukrainian resistance, tough positions of Ukrainian military and of Ukrainian leadership. So Russian leadership is trying to find another approach to, after capturing Mariupol, to start more active actions in Donbass and in near Kharkiv. So this is just military position. Nothing in political attitudes have changed. Ukraine is tough in its positions. It doesn't want to allow any occupation of Ukrainian territory. It doesn't want to change its pro-Western orientation, transatlantic orientation, and Russian leadership sees it as a vital threat to it and to Russia. So I see that the new wave of hostilities is imminent. The war is coming into its second stage, and on the results of new Russian offensive will depend how we will be finding the way out of the war. Any war finished with a peaceful agreement. There are three possibilities now. Either Russia succeeds, which is in attacking, which is doubtful because Ukrainians are really heroically fighting, or Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian army beats the Russian army, which seems not so very realistic because Russia is a huge country now. It involves more and more its forces. And the third, which seems to be, for me, a realistic one, it will be like a deadlock, like a new situation when nobody can move forward, but with some advances of Russian troops. Then after this, we will find the way how to have peaceful agreement. Now we are waiting for new clashes, for new heroic actions, and hopefully Russia will stop what it was doing, looting the ordinary people's homes. Now after the tragedy in Bucha, in Gostomel, Irpin, they must pay attention to this.
Thank you. Mr. Harley, how can you explain the unexpected visit of the British Prime Minister to Kiev? Is that a sign of winning the battle, or this is a challenge to Putin on one hand, and to all other allies saying that UK is the world leader in Europe? We fear nothing right now.
Well, let me thank you again for the invitation and say hello to Valentin. Good to see you again. But I think you're completely wrong in your assessment of the war plan. Just to go back to that for a second, we keep hearing from the West of the Russian playbook, the Russian war plan. The Russians announced from the beginning they had no intention to take over Ukraine or carry out a regime change. They said their main concern was Ukraine stay out of NATO, that they demilitarize Ukraine, which has been largely accomplished if you listen to Western military experts, and they want a solution to the Donbass, which could have included the Minsk II agreement, but for some reason, the Ukrainian government refuses to abide by its signature on that treaty. So the idea that somehow Russia is retreating with its tail between its legs, I think is just false. The Russians have a certain intention and they're carrying it out. Now, the case of the United Kingdom, they have an intention. Their intention is to punish Russia, to defeat Russia, militarily, maybe, but especially economically. That's what the sanction regime is about. It's economic warfare. And it has nothing to do with Ukraine. The passion for the Ukrainian people that you hear from Valentin, I share that. I don't want to see Ukrainians die. That's why I want NATO to stop pouring in arms and the West to stop telling Zelensky to keep fighting instead of negotiating. To stop this war, it's up to NATO and especially the US and the British to back off. The fact that the British continue to go into Ukraine, they've been training Ukrainian defense forces, including irregular and secret forces. The British and the US are continuing to push the line without any evidence that Russia is preparing a chemical weapon attack, which to me sounds like a false flag in which they're going to kill Ukrainians and it won't be the Russians who will do it. So the solution here is to stop the fighting, to accept the idea that Ukraine is not going into NATO. Zelensky said he supports that now, not going into NATO. So why continue to push to have the fight? It's to stop the Russians from moving into an alliance with China that threatens the existing shaky financial order.
Perfectly understood. German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier was on a visit to Warsaw, in which he said a return to normal diplomatic relations with Putin is not possible. Germany and Poland launched a joint appeal to Russia for an immediate humanitarian evacuation of the inhabitants of Mariupol.
There can be no return to normality with Russia under Putin. The Russian war crimes in Ukraine have become visible to the world. These crimes must be documented and solved, and the perpetrators, who are politically responsible, must be held accountable. We call for an immediate humanitarian evacuation of Mariupol inhabitants. It is a call that we both make in the direction of Russia, in view of the misery that we see. In view of the misery that we see daily.
Mr. Harley, as a German, would you please explain to me this letter? Why Germany is doing the same as Italy, trying to perform what UK and US has taken so far from procedures, moving forward to the extent that they are ready to damage the economy and the lives of Germans, although they are kind of not powerful likewise UK and US?
Well, it's interesting to note that Zelensky would not meet with Franz-Walter Steinmeier, although Steinmeier seems to be in line with the NATO policy. Look, Germany was an occupied country from 1945 to 1989. In many ways, it still acts as though it's an occupied country. Germany is being badly damaged by the sanctions policy. The head of Bosch, one of the leading auto component producers in the world, said that if Germany goes along with NATO and cuts off Russian gas, then the auto industry will collapse in Germany. The auto industry is about 25% of German workforce. So I think the problem with Germany is that the Germans no longer think about their national interests, while we're seeing many other countries around the world defending their national interests against the pressure of NATO and the US. For example, India. The US had a full court press on India this weekend to force the Indians to break with Russia. And Prime Minister Modi refused to do it. The same thing with Kenya. Kenya was asked to let Zelensky address the parliament, and they said, no, we have no reason to do it. We want peace. We don't want to take a side in this. Much of the world did not vote for the new sanctions against Russia. More nations either abstained or voted against it than voted for it. What we see is an attempt to impose an order dominated by the City of London, the International Monetary Fund, and Wall Street economically, and by NATO and the US and the United Kingdom physically through military means. I don't think this is going to last. I think that there's going to be a break in the West, especially as the economy is hit harder. 8.5% inflation in the United States. You can't blame that on Putin. Joe Biden's trying to do it. But that inflation started long before the first Russian soldier moved into Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Valentin, how can you explain the suspension of Russia last week from the Human Rights Council based on the principle of Moscow's violation of the international law? Although there were other countries which have done more than what Russia has committed, but no one dares even pointing fingers toward them. And you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, I know it from the experience of my own family, who lived near Bucha, in a town of Gostomel, and they were explaining to me about hundreds and thousands of local persons, of Ukrainian soldiers, of Russian soldiers who were killed, who were laying in the streets there. Nobody was putting them. Was burying them, but then Russians buried them. And in the end, there were thousands of people who were killed and buried there. And the whole world was terrified by this by these effects. Russian soldiers dared to have fighting in the towns and cities, which they should have avoided. They had no preparation for that. Ordinary people died, and the world is terrified by these results. So there is a normal result. The Western countries put forward this question in the United Nations, and Russia was suspended from the Human Rights Committee there. So what about others? There were not so much interest on the part of others, neither of Russia nor the West. So they neglected these issues. So what is important? To have independent structures acting outside the influences of the West, of the vested interests of the East or Center. But it's a big question. How the humanistically oriented people and organizations have how they can assess particular situations in Ukraine, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in African countries. So it is the task for the next steps of the world community how to be objective. But now we have the fact when a lot of Ukrainian civilians are dying, we can assess what was before done, what was in the previous 48 days. But what will be happening now when there is an imminent start of the new stage of the war? How Russian troops can be ordered by Russian leadership not to commit such acts which were there in Bucha, in Gostomel, and in the surrounding cities, and in many other cities. The lives of civilians have to be protected. Mm-hmm. We need to think about creation of the adequate institutions involving their Swiss government and NGOs, Chinese, Vietnamese, Turkish, who have influence, positive influence, who have good relations with Ukrainian and Russian civil society and with the relevant state institutions. It's not yet late. As I say, imminently we will have new wave of hostilities.
Understood.
How to try to avoid civilian deaths and destructions of the infrastructure.
Understood. Mr. HARLEY, Mr. Valentin has just raised a point saying that Human Rights Council is working based on the interest. So they suspend Russia because there is an interest on that, but they do not do the same thing with other countries. And for instance, the Zionist entity that still now they are committing genocide in Palestine, but no one dares to finger points for them. What are you saying about this? Is it really based on the interest?
Well, let me come back to that point in a moment, but let me start by countering a couple points that Valentin made. The majority of nations did not vote to suspend Russia. 93 voted to suspend Russia. 100 either voted against the suspension or abstained or didn't vote. 100 to 93. That's not the majority of nations, and the nations that are not condemning Russia are the largest nations in the world: India, China, Indonesia, countries with more than half the world's population. Secondly, the charges in Bucha, where's the investigation? The UN is going to turn that over to the Ukraine criminal prosecutor. How can you trust that to be a fair and honest investigation? The Russians were saying before you rush to judgment, and by the way, this is what the Indians said, the Indonesians said, the South Africans said, where's the due diligence and due process? Any lawyer will tell you that you can make a charge, but you have to have evidence. And so far, the evidence exists only in the hands of the Ukrainian forces. And they definitely have a vested interest. Now to your third point, which I think is the really important one. Why was there no outcry when the U.S. leveled Fallujah, when the U.S. slaughtered Muslim civilians supposedly targeting al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan? Why was there no outcry when the U.S. stole $9 billion in Afghan funds in a country which is facing humanitarian crisis? As to your other point, why no humanitarian outcry over the treatment of the Palestinian population, who are kept enslaved in a ghetto with little access to the outside world, limited amounts of electricity and water? Where's the outcry on those human rights violations? Is it only a human rights violation if a white European is threatened? No, this has to do with the anti-Russian drive from the United Kingdom and the United States. And I think this is something which discredits the United Nations. Now, I did a video the other day where I went after the Irish government for voting for this, and I got hundreds of emails from people from Ireland saying they're ashamed that their government went along with the UN vote to suspend Russia. So I don't think that the entire world is in agreement on this. The division is between those nations which insist they have a right to dictate the terms to the rest of the world, the so-called rules-based order, versus many nations that wish to defend their sovereign rights and the rights of their people to a better life. And I think that's the division. And I say again, I'm very upset that the Ukrainian government and NATO are turning the Ukrainian people into the victims of this proxy war against Russia.
Thank you, Mr. Harley. All right, thank you. Finland announced it was getting ready for historic decision before midsummer on whether to apply for NATO membership as a deterrent against Russia's military operation. Its neighboring country, Sweden, has also begun debating whether the country should join NATO. Both countries are non-aligned. However, public support for NATO membership is increasing, with 50% in Sweden and 60% in Finland. And Moscow opposed the enlargement of the alliance, warning that it will not bring stability to Europe. Before coming to you, Mr. Valentin, I will give this question to Mr. Harley. Do you think, Mr. Harley, that Europe is now at the brink of radical change and division? Last week, Hungary's president approved to pay by rubles to Russia. A couple of days ago, the British Prime Minister was strolling in Ukraine's capital. And now, Scandinavian countries are looking forward to join NATO. How can you read this event happening?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that the European Union portrays itself as a force of democracy. And yet, when 2/3 of the people of Hungary voted to re-elect President Orban, the EU started lecturing the Hungarian voters that they made a mistake, and the EU said they're going to provide more money to the opposition. The European Union announced they're going to carry out a regime change against the democratically elected government of Hungary. The same thing was towards Serbia, when the Prime Minister, President Vučić, won the election with 60% of the vote, and the European Union expressed their dismay over that. Well, how can you be for democracy when you refuse to allow the people of a country to vote for their choice of candidates? Now, similarly, I have colleagues in both Finland and Sweden who tell me that these polls about the desire of the Swedes and the Finns to join NATO are not accurate. That on talk shows, on the street, people are saying they don't want to be part of NATO. They don't want to be drawn into this confrontation. So I think this is, again, the idea of the post-Cold War Western powers, that NATO must be the sole power. And by the way, they are trying to move NATO into the Pacific region as well.
Perfectly.
NATO should be disbanded. There's going to be a big debate in France right now with the runoff election between Le Pen and Macron, whether France should even stay in NATO. So I think there's a lot of division within Europe, and there's a lot of media spinning going on to try and make the case for the great powers.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Valentin, based on what Mr. Harley has just said, based on what is happening right now in Ukraine, it is said that either Europe after this will be much stronger, or others are saying that this is the end of the EU partnership. Do you think Ukraine is the key to keep Europe united if it prevailed?
At this moment, Ukraine is a very important factor for unification of Europe and for having more solidarity in transatlantic cooperation. Well, these are formal features of that process when Sweden and Finland will apply for the full membership in NATO. But it means nothing in practical terms, because these Western nations already closely cooperate with the Western alliances, defense alliances, and nothing will change. Well, they may join NATO as well as Austria, as San Marino, as Monaco, or who would like to join it, but it will not change the correlation of forces. The correlation of forces is now fixed. Russia is fighting against the united West, and it was a big trap for the Russian nation, to which its leadership, which lost its orientation in the world, which who assess its own forces too highly when they are not so, and it led to tragedy not only of Ukrainians but also of the Russian nation. History will show that it was a not only criminal act but strategically, civilizationally, a wrong trap. a long step which led civilization of East Slavic people to a very difficult situation when one part of this civilization, Ukrainians, most of them, they hate not only Russian leadership, not only the present Russian state, but just ordinary Russians. It's a tragedy. It's worse than the tragedy of Iraqis and Kuwaitis. Well, now when you ask Kuwaitis what their attitude towards Iraqis, many of Kuwaitis, they have they from the bottom of their heart, they do not like, they dislike the Iraqis because what was committed 30 years ago, it is something similar created in the territory of the former Soviet Union in Ukraine and Russia. So this is a very dangerous, counterproductive for everybody step, and it creates dangers of total confrontation between the West and
Thank you,
Russia.
Mr.
Russia can hardly win in
Valentin.
that. It will be new sufferings.
Thank you, Mr. Valentin. $11.67 billion is the number of the Chinese overall trade increase with Russia in March, just this last month. Mr. HARLEY, I believe this is what US and UK were afraid from the very beginning. Russia-China alliance. Here it is. It is happening in the midst of this operation. Do you think that US failed to damage Russia's plans and save the bankruptcy of the Western financial system?
Well, I think you just hit on the key problem. The Western financial system is in terrible shape. The only reason we haven't had a banking collapse is because the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank are pumping trillions of dollars of liquidity to keep banks afloat, banks which are technically bankrupt. This would be a huge scandal if it were reported, but it's not being reported. Instead, we're hearing endless talk about the Russians this, the Russians that. Let's go back to 1990, when it was clear that there was an opportunity to have a unified arrangement which included Russia as part of Europe. Instead, the West sent in the bankers, the London bankers, the Harvard bankers, and they looted Russia to the bone. And by the way, Valentin, you know this, they looted Ukraine to the bone. Ukraine's standard of living in 1991 was higher than it was by 2014, and it's continued to drop because of the looting process of the International Monetary Fund and the European Union. So the West doesn't care about the lives of Ukrainians or Russians. What they're afraid of is that their ability to impose their new global reset, their new dollar-based financial system, is threatened by the fact that most of the rest of the world is rejecting it. They don't want to put their sovereignty, to give up their sovereignty in order to be able to crawl to the International Monetary Fund to borrow money to pay debt. By the way, Ukraine has a very big debt coming due to the IMF soon. How is that going to be paid for when the debt is increasing every time new weapons are shipped in? So the question of the financial side of this is extremely important.
Okay.
What Russia and China represent is a potential to break from a financial system based on monetary values and printing of money to back up speculative interests.
Thank you, Mr. HARLEY. I have been called by the technical staff because we don't have a lot of time, 2 minutes left. Mr. Valentin, after almost 2 months, 49 days now to be precise, since the operation started, what is your expectation?
Well, I told already that my nearest expectations are continuation of the war, entering into a new cycle of the war, which will lead to the decision how we will find the peace, either on the positions of the strengths of Russia, if they manage to occupy more and more territories of Ukraine, which is not likely, or from the position that Ukraine can sustain these attacks and will demand Russian troops withdrawal. And what is also very important, that we saw the effects of the irony of history. Everything what Russian leader was putting forward, it's placed just in the reverse way. Just on the reverse, everywhere in the geopolitical terms, in Ukrainian political situation, in Russian place in the world.
Perfectly
so it was a trap for Russia, which Russian leader made. And we need to find constructive
so
way
much.
out.
Mr. Valentin. With this, our special coverage draws to an end. Thank you, dear guests, for this vivid discussion, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping us here with us in AL24 News. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.